Julian Vane was a man who lived by the second. An obsessive horologist, a fixer of clocks, he found comfort in the predictable tick-tock of gears. But his world stopped when he received a letter from a legal firm regarding his estranged grandfather, Silas Vane. Silas had died in his remote estate, Iron-Dial Manor, leaving everything to Julian. The manor sat on a lonely cliff overlooking a gray, churning sea. It was an architectural nightmare. A house built entirely around a central tower that housed a clock so massive its ticking could be felt in the marrow of one's bones. When Julian entered the foyer, he didn't find dust or cobwebs. He found clocks, thousands of them. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, sundials, and strange brass contraptions that didn't measure hours, but things like heartbeats remaining and breath capacity. In the center of the library lay Silas's last will, written in shaky, frantic ink. Julian, time is not a river. It is a predator. We think we spend time, but time spins us. I have found a great balance, but the price was my soul. The clockwork pulse must never stop. If the main tower falls silent, the seconds between will come for their dead. That night, Julian lay in bed, unable to sleep due to the rhythmic thump of the tower clock. Suddenly, the sound skipped. Tick, tick, silence. The air in the room instantly turned ice cold. Julian grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The thousands of clocks in the house had all stopped at exactly 3:14 a.m. Then he heard it, a wet, dragging sound coming from the shadows. A figure emerged, tall and impossibly thin. Its skin looked like translucent parchment stretched over rusted gears. Instead of a face, it had a massive brass clock face embedded in its skull, the needles spinning backward at a violent speed. Julian, the creature groaned, the sound of grinding metal vibrating from its chest. Your grandfather promised us more. We are hungry for the years you haven't lived yet. The creature lunged, its fingers elongated into sharp, copper pendulums. Julian realized then that Silas hadn't been a clockmaker. He had been a jailer, and the prisoner was time itself. Julian scrambled backward as the creature's copper pendulum fingers sliced through the air, inches from his throat. He bolted toward the heavy oak doors of the library, the rhythmic thump of his own heart now the only clock left in the house. He plummeted down a spiral staircase that led deep into the foundations of Iron-Dial Manor. Here, the air was thick with the scent of machine oil and ozone. He burst into a massive, subterranean workshop lit by the flickering orange glow of coal furnaces. This was the room of rusted minutes. Row upon row of wooden chairs lined the walls. Sitting in them were the mechanical husks, men and women in tattered 19th century livery. They were perfectly still, but as Julian passed, he saw the horrific truth. A large, brass wind-up key was buried deep into the base of each of their spines. "Help me," a voice croaked. Julian froze. One of the husks, an elderly man who must have been Silas's butler, was twitching. His movements were jerky, like a film reel missing every second frame. "The master key," the butler wheezed. "It's in the gear pit. You must win the heart before the seconds between find you." Suddenly, the shadow at the top of the stairs lengthened. The creature with the clock face head, the Time-Stalker, was descending. It didn't walk. It glitched through space, appearing 5 feet closer with every blink of Julian's eyes. Julian sprinted toward the center of the room, where a massive pit revealed the churning, gargantuan gears of the tower clock. Suspended over the grinding metal teeth was a pedestal holding a heavy, golden key shaped like a human vertebra. As he reached for the key, the Time-Stalker appeared directly behind him. Its clock face head began to chime, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that shattered the glass of every pocket watch in Julian's pockets. "Julian Vane," the creature hissed, "your grandfather traded 40 years of your bloodline for a single hour of immortality. We have come to collect the interest." The Time-Stalker grabbed Julian's arm. Julian felt a terrifying sensation. His skin began to wrinkle, his hair grayed, and his joints stiffened. The creature was literally draining his age. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Julian kicked the pedestal. The master key tumbled into his hand. He didn't use it on a door. He saw a small, hidden keyhole in the side of the Time-Stalker's brass face and shoved the key in, turning it with all his might. There was a sound of a mainspring snapping. The creature froze, its needles spinning wildly before stopping at the symbol of an hourglass. It collapsed into a heap of rusted gears and dry skin. Julian fell to the floor, his youth rushing back into his limbs as the stolen time returned to him. But the victory was hollow. The great gears in the pit beneath him began to turn in the wrong direction. The great balance was broken. "You've reversed the flow," the butler screamed from his chair, his voice fading. "The house isn't measuring time anymore. It's eating it." The walls of the workshop began to melt into a gray, misty void. Julian looked up and saw that the ceiling had vanished, replaced by a sky filled with trillions of falling pocket watches, all shattered. The floor of the workshop didn't just break, it unspooled. Julian felt himself stretched like a wire as he tumbled into the gear pit. But instead of being crushed by the metal teeth, he fell into a world of sepia-toned fog. He landed on a path made of discarded calendar pages, stretching infinitely into a horizon of ticking shadows. This was the Labyrinth of Yesterday. "Is anyone there?" Julian's voice didn't echo. It repeated his own words coming back to him from 3 minutes ago, then 3 years ago. As he walked, the fog parted to reveal time cells, shimmering bubbles of reality. Inside one, he saw himself at 10 years old, crying over a broken watch. In another, he saw himself as a young man, leaving Iron-Dial Manor after a bitter argument with his grandfather. "You shouldn't have come back, Julian," a voice spat. Julian turned. Standing on the path was Julian. But it was the Julian from 5 years ago, sharper, angrier, and holding a heavy brass pipe. Behind him stood a dozen other Julians. A toddler crawling with predatory speed, a middle-aged version with a scarred face, and a withered, ancient version leaning on a cane of bone. "The labyrinth only has enough now for one of us," the 5 years ago Julian said, his eyes glowing with a desperate, golden light. "If we kill the current you, one of us gets to take your place in the waking world. We can live again." The past Julians lunged. It was a chaotic, surreal brawl. The toddler Julian bit at his ankles with teeth made of iron needles, while the scarred Julian swung a heavy pendulum. Julian realized he couldn't fight them physically. They were ghosts of his own history. He reached into his pocket and gripped the master key. He noticed that each of his past selves had a faint, glowing cord connected to their chests, the line of sequence. "You're not real," Julian shouted, dodging a blow from his younger self. "You're just the footprints I left behind." He didn't strike his past selves. Instead, he knelt and drove the master key into the path made of calendar pages. He turned the key forward. The labyrinth groaned. The sepia fog turned a violent neon blue. Time began to accelerate. The toddler Julian aged into a boy, the boy into a man, and the scarred Julian withered into the ancient Julian in a matter of seconds. "No, stop the count," they screamed, their voices merging into a single, distorted howl. As they reached the end of their potential time, they didn't die, they blurred. They became a stream of golden sand that swirled around Julian, entering his skin. He wasn't killing them, he was reclaiming them. The weight of all his past experiences, every joy and every trauma, hit him at once. His mind felt like it was bursting with decades of lived life. But as the sand settled, the path beneath him vanished. He was left standing on a giant, floating clock hand that was rotating over a vast, dark ocean. In the center of the ocean stood the tower of the great pendulum, and perched upon it was a figure wearing Silas Vane's clothes, but with a body made of 1,000 humming hummingbirds. "Julian," the figure chirped in 1,000 voices. "You've gathered your past. Now, come and face your future." The giant clock hand beneath Julian's feet was cold and slick with a strange, oily mist. It moved with a jarring clunk every 60 seconds, vibrating through his boots. Below him, the sea of lost seconds churned. A vast, black ocean not of water, but of liquid mercury and discarded memories. As Julian balanced himself, White shapes began to break the surface of the dark waves. They were the drowned minutes. These were the spirits of those who had killed time, the procrastinators, the idle, and the broken who had let their lives slip away. They looked like humans, but their skin was translucent, and their bodies were filled with gears that had rusted shut. "Give us a moment," they wailed, their voices sounding like the slow drip of a leaky faucet. Just one productive second. Dozens of pale, wet hands gripped the edge of the clock hand. The metal began to tilt under their collective weight. One of the spirits, a woman with seaweed-tangled hair and eyes like empty watch faces, pulled herself up. "You have so much now left, Julian," she hissed. "It's heavy. Let us carry it for you. Let us pull you down into the stillness." Julian felt a wave of crushing lethargy hit him. His legs felt like lead. His eyelids grew heavy. The sea of lost seconds was an emotional vacuum, sucking away the will to move forward. He saw the tower of the great pendulum in the distance, but it felt a million miles away. "Why bother? Why run? I can't move," Julian whispered, sinking to his knees. The master key in his hand began to glow a dull, warning red. It was heating up. He realized the key responded to his intent. If he gave up, the key would melt into useless slag. "No," Julian growled, biting his tongue until he tasted blood to snap himself out of the trance. "My time isn't a gift for ghosts. It's my burden to carry." He stood up and slammed the master key against the metal clock hand. Instead of turning it, he used it as a conductor. He envisioned the most frantic, productive moment of his life. The night he stayed up for 72 hours fixing a royal chronometer. The key erupted with a frantic, golden electricity. The current surged through the clock hand, shocking the drowned minutes. They shrieked as the raw energy of purpose burned their rusted gears. They fell back into the mercury sea, dissolving into foam. The clock hand began to spin faster, no longer waiting for the minute to pass. It became a motorized bridge, whisking Julian across the dark water toward the base of the tower. As he reached the stone platform of the tower, the humming figure in Silas's clothes descended. The 1,000 hummingbirds that made up its body vibrated so fast they created a blur of feathers and static. "You've crossed the waste," the figure said, the voices now sounding like a choir of ticking metronomes. "But the tower is a vertical path. To reach the top, you must climb the spiral of regret. Every step up requires you to leave a piece of your future behind." The figure pointed to the entrance. Above the door, a sign was carved in human bone. "The price of ascension is the tomorrow you will never see." The interior of the Tower of the Great Pendulum was a vertical void. There were no walls, only a staircase that wound upward into an infinite darkness. But these weren't stone steps. They were shimmering holographic platforms made of unborn days. As Julian placed his foot on the first step, a vision flickered to life within the light. He saw himself standing in a sun-drenched garden, holding the hand of a woman he had yet to meet. He felt a surge of warmth, a love that hadn't happened yet but was meant to move higher. The choir of hummingbirds echoed from above. "You must surrender the potential. To gain the tower, you must lose the life." Julian hesitated. The step began to fade, his foot slipping into the void. To stabilize the stairs, he had to reach out and crush the vision. With a shaking hand, he squeezed the holographic image. It shattered like glass, and the step beneath him became solid as granite. He took another step. This time, he saw himself as an old man, surrounded by grandchildren, teaching a young boy how to oil a pocket watch. It was a vision of a peaceful death, a reward for a life well lived. Crunch! Julian felt a physical pain in his chest as he destroyed that future. He was literally murdering his own happiness to save his soul. "Why?" Julian roared into the dark. "Why must the guardian be hollow?" "Because time has no heart," the voices replied. "It only has a beat. To control the beat, you must become the machine." He climbed for what felt like hours or perhaps years. He sacrificed a career as a world-renowned scientist. He sacrificed a quiet retirement by the sea. He sacrificed the chance to ever find true peace. With every step, his face grew more gaunt, and his eyes took on a metallic, golden sheen. He was becoming less human and more chronometric. Halfway up the spiral, he encountered the ghost of Julian Vane. His grandfather wasn't a monster here. He was a broken man chained to a massive, rusted gear that served as a landing on the staircase. "Stop, Julian!" Silas cried, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "I climbed this path. I gave up my tomorrows just like you. Look at me. I am the lubricant for the great machine. They use my sorrow to grease the gears." Silas's body was being slowly pulled into the teeth of the gear. He wasn't dying. He was being processed. "If you reach the top," Silas warned, "you won't be the master of time. You will be its battery." Suddenly, the stairs behind Julian began to collapse. The unborn days he had already crushed were turning into a black hole of never was. He had no choice but to keep going, but the final step to the summit wasn't a vision of joy. It was a vision of now. He saw himself, right here, turning the master key. Julian realized the trap. If he stepped on the final stair, he would be looped. He would become a closed circuit, powering the tower forever with the energy of his own struggle. He looked at the master key in his hand. It was no longer golden. It was a deep, pulsating violet. He looked at Silas, then at the summit. "I won't be the battery," Julian whispered. "I'll be the short circuit." Julian leaped from the collapsing spiral of regret onto the summit platform. The air here didn't just smell of oil. It tasted of copper and ancient, stale centuries. In the center of the vast, circular chamber stood the Mainspring. It was a terrifying sight, a giant, anatomical heart the size of a carriage. But instead of muscle, it was constructed from translucent rubies and interlaced brass wires. It beat with a deafening, metallic thrum, clang thump. Clang thump. So, the air arrives with a pocket full of nothing. A voice boomed. From the shadows behind the heart stepped the Chronos Prime. It was a being of pure geometry, a shifting mass of golden triangles and silver circles that constantly reorganized itself into a vaguely humanoid shape. It had no eyes, only a spinning sundial where a chest should be. "You have sacrificed your children, your peace, and your very sunrises to stand here." The Chronos Prime resonated. "Feed the heart, Julian. Insert the master key and become the new pulse. Your grandfather is worn out. His sorrow no longer provides enough friction." Julian looked at the rubies in the heart. They weren't jewels. They were crystallized moments of human life, stolen seconds from millions of people, all being pumped into the machine to keep the great balance for the elite few who lived outside of time. "You're not keeping the world running," Julian said, his voice cold. "You're hoarding it. You're a parasite living in the ticks of clock." "I am a clock," the entity roared. "Without the pulse, the universe becomes a static photograph. No movement, no growth, just a frozen scream." The Chronos Prime lunged. It didn't punch. It manipulated the time around Julian. 1 second, Julian was 10 feet away. The next, he was being crushed by a localized gravity well of heavy time. Julian felt his bones beginning to fracture under the weight of 1,000 years pressing down on his shoulders. He looked at the master key. It was vibrating so hard it was blurring in his hand. "I won't be the battery," he remembered. Instead of trying to fight the Prime, Julian crawled toward the Mainspring heart. He saw the keyhole, a jagged slit in the center of the ruby valves. The Chronos Prime realized his intent and shrieked, a sound of grinding tectonic plates. "If you overwind it, you destroy everything." "Not everything," Julian gasped, his lungs burning. "Just your buffet." With a scream of defiance, Julian thrust the master key into the heart and didn't just turn it. He spun it. He poured every ounce of his remaining life force, his stolen memories, and his reclaimed past into the turn. The heart didn't just beat faster. It began to glow a blinding, ultraviolet white. The gears of the tower began to scream as they were pushed beyond the limits of physics. Click, 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 click. The overwind began. The Chronos Prime began to shatter, its geometric parts flying off like shrapnel. The tower of the great pendulum started to shake as the mainspring of reality began to tighten toward its breaking point. The explosion didn't produce fire. It produced static, When the mainspring heart shattered, the sound was like a billion mirrors breaking at once. Julian was thrown backward, not into a wall, but through the very concept of where and when. When his eyes finally opened, the tower was gone. Iron-Dial Manor was gone. He was standing in the fracture. The landscape was a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of eras. To his left, a prehistoric jungle breathed thick, humid air. To his right, a neon-lit futuristic city hovered in a sky of liquid purple. Pieces of the shattered ruby heart, the chrono shards, were scattered across this broken terrain like glowing embers. "The clock is broken," a voice whispered, rattling like dry leaves. 3 figures emerged from a tear in the sky. They were tall, draped in long, gray coats made of discarded film reels. Their faces were smooth, featureless masks with a single vertical slit in the center. These were the second-hand men, scavengers who lived at the heat death of the universe, coming back to feast on the remains of a broken timeline. One of them held a vacuum-like device made of rusted brass, sucking up a glowing ruby shard from the ground. "Stop!" Julian yelled, reaching for his pocket. The master key was gone, replaced by a jagged, glowing scar on his palm that hummed with the same frequency as the shards. The second-hand men turned in unison. The weaver of the overwind. They spoke together, their voices a low-frequency hum. "You broke the cycle. Now we harvest the fragments. Once we collect the heart, we will build a fixed moment, 1 second of agony that will last forever. We shall live in that second, eternal and unchanging." They moved with terrifying fluidity, their bodies blurring as they skipped across the fractured landscape. Julian realized that because he had overwound the heart, he was now unanchored. He didn't have to walk. He could blink. He focused on the shard in the scavenger's hand. "I'm already there," he thought. Instantly, the world smeared into a blur of color. Julian reappeared directly in front of the lead scavenger. He didn't have a weapon, but the scar on his palm acted like a magnet. He grabbed the scavenger's wrist, and the chrono shard reacted, sending a jolt of raw, unprocessed time through Julian's arm. Julian saw the scavenger's history. It wasn't a man, but a collection of wasted moments given form. By touching the shard, Julian didn't just fight him, he fast-forwarded him. The second-hand man let out a silent scream as his gray coat turned to dust and his form dissolved into the entropic heat death he belonged to. The shard fell into Julian's hand, merging with the scar on his palm. But there were hundreds of shards, and the fracture was beginning to shrink. The different eras were colliding violently. A Tyrannosaurus Rex was currently being crushed by a falling skyscraper from the 25th century. "Julian," a familiar voice called out. From a portal of Victorian London stepped the mechanical husks from the workshop, their wind-up keys glowing. They weren't slaves anymore. They were the remnants. "We can help you hold the line," the butler shouted, wielding a heavy gear lance. "But you must find the prime fragment. It's fallen into the void of the first tick, the beginning of everything." Julian looked toward a white, blinding light at the center of the fracture. If he went there, he might never come back to a world that made sense. Julian dived into the white light. The sensation was no longer like falling. It was like being rewritten. The sounds of the fracture, the prehistoric roars and futuristic hums, vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. He stood in the void of the first tick. There was no floor, no sky, only a vast expanse of milky white haze. In the center of this nothingness floated the origin engine. It was beautiful and terrifying, a colossal, golden sphere that looked like a cross between a human heart and a sun. It didn't tick. It vibrated with the potential of every second that had ever existed or would ever exist. This was the birth of time, and standing before was the origin architect, a figure made of translucent glass, whose every movement left a trail of light that formed the first constellations. "You have come to the beginning to seek an end," the architect said. His voice wasn't spoken. It was felt as a pulse in Julian's blood. The Chronos Prime was a parasite, yes, but he was also a cage. Without the cage, time is a wild, ravenous thing. It will burn through the universe in a single flash of heat, and then there will be only cold, dark forever. The architect held out a hand. Inside his palm was the prime fragment, the largest piece of the ruby heart. It beat with a violent, erratic rhythm. If you place this fragment back into the engine, the architect continued, you will restart the clock. You will return to Iron-Dial Manor. You will be human again. But the cycle of sacrifice will begin anew. There must always be a thorn or a vein to bleed for the hours. Julian looked at the scar on his palm. It was glowing so brightly, it was beginning to dissolve his skin. And if I destroy the engine, then time becomes a sea without a shore. No past, no future. Just a chaotic always. People will be born and die in the same breath. Civilizations will rise and fall in the blink of an eye. Freedom, but at the cost of meaning. Suddenly, the white void began to crack. The second-hand men had followed him. They didn't care about the engine or the clock. They wanted the prime fragment to freeze reality into their eternal second of pain. They swarmed the architect, their gray coats turning into shadows that tried to smother the light of the beginning. The choice, Julian, the architect cried as he was pulled into the darkness. The clock or the chaos? Julian realized that the master key hadn't just been a tool to open doors or overwin hearts. It was a tuning fork. He struck his scarred palm against the golden surface of the origin engine. He didn't want the parasitic cage of his grandfather, and he didn't want the total destruction of the void. He wanted a pulse. He thrust the prime fragment into the engine, but instead of letting it lock into place, he used the energy of his own heartbeat to shatter the fragment even further into a billion tiny, microscopic dust particles. "What are you doing?" the second-hand men shrieked as they were blown back by the sudden release of energy. "I'm not winding the clock," Julian whispered, his body beginning to turn into light. "I'm giving it back. No more hoarding. Every living thing gets to own its own seconds." The white void of the first tick didn't fade. It shattered like a frosted window. Julian felt a violent pull, as if he were being dragged through a keyhole by his soul. When the light finally dimmed, he was no longer a being of light or geometry. He was lying on cold, damp earth. He was back at Iron-Dial Manor, but the house was a skeleton. The tower had collapsed, and the thousands of clocks that once lined the hallways were now nothing but rusted heaps of brass and glass. The sun was setting over the gray sea, but the light felt different. It felt heavy, honest, and fleeting. Home," Julian wheezed, clutching his chest. His heart beat with a natural, uneven rhythm. The great pulse was gone, but as he tried to stand, the shadows between the ruins began to stretch and thicken. From the wreckage of the clock tower, the time wraiths emerged. These were not the second-hand men or the prime. They were the lost potential, the literal ghosts of the hours Julian had destroyed in the spiral of regret. They were flickering silhouettes of the man Julian could have been, the scientist, the father, the happy old man. But because he had shattered the origin engine, these versions of him had nowhere to go. They were homeless time, and they were angry. "You gave our lives to the world," Julian, the scientist ghost hissed, its voice a hollow echo. "But what about us? You used us as fuel, and now we are just smoke." The wraiths circled him, their touch bringing a localized, agonizing aging. Where they brushed against his skin, his flesh turned gray and brittle. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to occupy him. They wanted to cram their non-existent lives back into his single, mortal body. Julian felt his vision blurring. He was 25, then 50, then 80, all in the span of a few breaths. The weight of the lives not lived was crushing his actual life. "I can't contain you all," Julian gasped, his knees hitting the dirt. He looked at his palm. The scar of the master key was gone, but in its place was a simple, ticking pulse in his wrist. He realized that by freeing time, he had become the only anchor left in this location. "You want a life?" Julian shouted at the circling ghosts. "Then take the one I have, but you have to share it." He didn't fight the wraiths. He performed this stitch of the present moment. He opened his mind and his heart, inviting the ghosts in. He stopped grieving for the potential Julians and accepted them as part of his own story. As the wraiths dived into him, the agonizing aging stopped. Instead of turning into a withered husk, Julian's eyes glowed with a kaleidoscopic light. He felt every version of himself settle into a single, complex consciousness. He was one man, but he carried the wisdom of 1,000 lives that never happened. The shadows dissipated. The manor was silent. But as the moon rose, Julian saw a figure standing by the cliff's edge. It was the grandfather, Silas Vane. He wasn't a monster or a battery anymore. He looked like a tired old man. "You did it, Julian," Silas said softly. "The clock is gone, but you should know, the world isn't used to being free. They will try to build a new cage, and you're the only one who knows where the key is hidden." Silas pointed toward the horizon, where a new type of light was beginning to glow, a digital, cold blue light. A new enemy was rising, one that didn't use gears and brass, but code and light to steal the world's seconds. The ruins of Iron-Dial Manor were no longer isolated. As the sun began to rise on the final day, the sound of rhythmic ticking was replaced by the high-pitched whine of drones. Down the cliffside, a fleet of black, sleek vehicles arrived. Men in sterilized white suits stepped out, carrying scanners and high-frequency emitters. They belonged to Epic Corp, a global tech conglomerate that had been monitoring the temporal spikes Julian had caused. At their head stood Dr. Eris Thorne, a descendant of the very lineage Julian had crossed paths with in the past. He didn't want a clock, he wanted a server. "Mr. Vane," Eris said, his voice amplified through a headset. "You've done the impossible. You've decentralized time, but the world can't handle that kind of freedom. Markets are crashing because the seconds no longer have a fixed value. People are losing focus because now is too broad. We are here to help." Behind Eris, they were erecting the Nexus Spire, a digital needle designed to capture the mortal rhythm Julian had released and compress it into a stream of data. They wanted to turn time into a currency. Pay for an hour of peace. Subscribe to a longer life. "You're just building a new cage," Julian said, his voice echoing with the strength of 1,000 lies he now carried within him. "Only this one has no keyhole. It's a necessary cage, Julian," Eris countered. "If we don't regulate the pulse, the universe will eventually drift into the Great Stutter. We are the stabilizers." The spire began to glow with a cold, blue light. Julian felt his own heartbeat begin to sync with the digital frequency. Epic Corp was trying to upload the Origin Engine's energy from his blood. Julian looked at the ruins of his grandfather's tower. He realized that as long as he stood there as a guardian, he was a target. To save time, he had to stop being a man and become a history. He walked to the center of the collapsed gear pit. He didn't use a key this time. He used the final rhythm. He closed his eyes and channeled every one of the unborn days he had absorbed. The scientist, the father, the old man, and sent them outward, not as a weapon, but as a virus of randomness. "You want to quantify time?" Julian whispered. "Then try to measure a dream." A massive wave of golden and violet light erupted from Julian's body. It hit the Nexus Spire, and the blue light shattered. The digital screens of the Epic Corp soldiers went haywire, displaying millions of different timelines at once. For a brief moment, every person on Earth felt a surge of pure, unmanaged life. A second that felt like an eternity, a memory that hadn't happened, a dream that felt like home. The spire overloaded and melted into a heap of slag. When the light faded, Julian Vane was gone. There was no body, no ghost, and no light. Dr. Eris Thorne searched the ruins, but found nothing but a single, ancient pocket watch lying in the dirt. When he opened it, there were no gears inside, only a small, living blade of grass growing in the shape of a heart. The world moved on. Time remained free, erratic, and precious. People still aged and they still died, but they did so on their own terms. However, legend says that if you ever find yourself in a moment of pure, undistracted joy, a moment where time seems to stand still, you might see a man in the corner of your eye. He wears an old watchmaker's apron, and he smiles as he winds a small, silver key in the air, ensuring that the world keeps beating one beautiful, unscripted second at a time.